Okay, guys, and we're back with another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest. I'm Seth from the Lonely Stoner podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about what's next for Paddy Pimblett. Of course, Paddy Pimblett fought at UFC 314 in Miami, where he absolutely dominated Michael Chandler, in a great fight. And like I said, Paddy Pimblett, for the most part, done what he needed to do to Michael Chandler to win that fight. We saw Paddy take some shots from Michael Chandler, and even now, Michael at this point in Michael Chandler's career, where he's really not knocking out anyone, and his only knockout wins. His only wins are by knockout, actually, in the UFC. Tony and Dan Hooker. But even at this point, Michael Chandler's not really knocking out anyone. But like I said, that's by the by. He's still one of the bigger punches in the division. Michael Chandler's still one of the bigger punches at lightweight. And we saw Paddy comfortably take those shots. Paddy didn't get rocked. He didn't get put on his back. He ate them. And at that point, when I'm seeing Paddy Pimblett take those sort of big shots from Michael Chandler, I'm like, if Michael Chandler's not knocking you out, probably in theory no one's knocking you out, because I wouldn't say punch for punch Poirier punches harder than Chandler. I definitely wouldn't say Charles does. I would say maybe Islam is the only one comparable in terms of power, but Islam's not a huge puncher, I would say, but Islam's able to generate big power from his kicks because dude's a big guy, like Paddy, actually. Paddy's also, one thing we saw from that win against Michael Chandler was how big he is for the division as well. Paddy Pimblett feels huge for lightweight, and like I said, the only guys that are really going to be that similar sort of size as him is a guy like Islam. When I think about it, Dustin Poirier, former featherweight, who else? Charles Oliveira, former featherweight. These guys aren't huge lightweights the same way Paddy is a huge lightweight. Islam probably walks around that, I think, we're hearing 185, 190. If Islam's fighting at that, Paddy's walking around that as well, if not more. So that would be a good fight. I mean, that takes us naturally into, is Paddy next for the title? I don't think he's next up for the title. I think that Islam fight, he's probably, in my opinion, I think he's 2 fights away from an Islam fight, a title fight. Obviously, this win for Paddy Pimblett against Michael Chandler is the biggest win of Paddy Pimblett's career. And along with that, it's probably the best performance of his career too. Of course, he had a good performance against Bobby Green and done his thing against Tony, but Michael Chandler was the most game out of those 3 guys. You've got a guy like Bobby Green, of course, Bobby Green wants to win this fight, wants to win these fights, but Bobby Green knows deep down that if he loses these fights, it's not the end for Bobby Green. Because when you're one of these fighters that are a win some, lose some type of fighter, you're going to lose fights, right? Tony Ferguson was shot to bits. And then, like I said, Michael Chandler was the first guy at this high level that he's fought that was probably really game. Like Michael Chandler, say what you want about Michael Chandler, but dude will show up to fight. And he'll leave it all in the cage. Right, he's got bad IQ, obviously, terrible IQ, but he's a game athlete. Michael Chandler, he's a game athlete. But like I said, I think Paddy's 2 fights away from an Islam fight. What I would want to see would be Paddy's next 2 fights. I would want to see him face Dan Hooker next. Obviously, Dan Hooker was meant to fight Michael Chandler, but then Dan Hooker had to pull out. Dan Hooker's coming off a split decision win over Mateus Ganrot. So Dan Hooker would be a good fight for that. I think stylistically, anyone Dan Hooker fights, Dan Hooker's capable of getting a good fight out of anyone because he's just so scrappy and he's just so much forward pressure and just always trying to, fight, which is good. That's the right way to do it. You're supposed to want to push the pace, advance the action, and, try and do something rather than just being happy with winning decisions every round, right? So Paddy v Dan Hooker would be a really good fight in my opinion. I think Paddy wins it. I think Paddy probably submits Dan Hooker because, again, Paddy's going to be so much bigger than him. And Paddy, if he wants to, he'll probably ragdoll Dan Hooker because Dan Hooker's not a huge puncher. Like I've said, if you're taking Michael Chandler's shots, you can probably walk through Dan Hooker's shots. Now, Dan Hooker throws a different sort of volume. In terms of volume, it's not really comparable, but power, punch for punch, Chandler's obviously the bigger puncher, right? But yeah, Dan Hooker v Paddy would be what I would have next. I have Paddy winning that. I think, yeah, like I said, I think Paddy submits him. And then next, you're like, it's probably Arman or Charles. It's probably Arman or Charles. Like I said, Dustin Poirier's in the mix, but I don't think he'll fight Paddy for his last fight. Even though Dustin Poirier has been very complimentary of Paddy these past few days, where obviously Paddy's recently won his fight, he was quite complimentary of him, saying like he's the legit real deal and all that as well, which he is. To be fair, Dustin Poirier's comments on Paddy are very valid because he's, echoing a lot of stuff I'm saying in terms of, wow, I wasn't too sure about him before, but if you can beat Michael Chandler like that, then you've got something about you for sure, right? So I don't think it'd be Dustin Poirier. I think, yeah, logically for me, I'm thinking Dan Hooker, then Charles or Arman. Depending on who gets the next title fight, I think it should be Arman. Arman's the number one contender, but Dana's not really too happy with Arman because he pulled out, so could be a bit techie for him, but we'll see. Yeah, I'd be curious to know what you guys think. What's next for Paddy? Another episode of the Seth Side Quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.